Good morning. Thank you for having us here today. Steve and I are from the Eastern Museum of Motor Racing, which is a small museum and research library, which is located near Gettysburg in York Springs, Pennsylvania. Steve Bubb is an accomplished journalist and historian. He's worked with the area auto racing news since 1981 and has a column in the newspaper on a weekly basis. He also published a book on the history of Silver Spring Speedway. And right now he's serving as the librarian at the Eastern Museum of Motor Racing. Steve and I have a shared background with Silver Spring Speedway. It's a track located in central Pennsylvania that my family owned and promoted. And I actually went to grad school and have a degree in history, and my dissertation focused on racing in the Mid-Atlantic region. My name is Alison Kreitzer, and I'm the executive director at the Eastern Museum of Motor Racing. I've been there for 2 years. So we're thrilled to be here today to tell you a little bit more about the Eastern Museum and discuss a century of speed, Pennsylvania motor racing. Slide, please. Here's an image of the Eastern Museum from the outside, and our museum has been located in York Springs since 1989 when the museum was constructed. Slide, please. EMMR's mission is to preserve and interpret the history of Eastern motor racing. Our collection traces the development of motorsports east of the Mississippi River from the late 19th century to the present. We have over 50 historic racing machines on display, and our collection also includes racing memorabilia, as well as ephemera, textiles, safety equipment, photographs, and videos. Next slide, please.
EMMR is also home to the Chris Economaki Research Library, and our archival collection includes racing newspapers, programs, books, organizational records, and scrapbooks. Several of the photographs and programs that you will see today are from our library collection. We have a new reading room for researchers, and we encourage all of you to contact us about your research interests. We're also currently working to inventory our collection to make it more accessible to visitors. Slide, please.
So we're thrilled to have you online as well as in person. And for those of you that are online, if you have questions throughout the presentation, please make sure to put them in the chat, and we'll be happy to answer them at the end of our presentation. If you're here locally, you may have been to EMMR, and you may have known that we've been in the central Pennsylvania area since 1975. For several of you online, this may be the first time you're hearing about our museum. So just to give you a brief background, the Williams Grove Old Timers was founded in 1975 by Williams Grove Speedway promoter Jack Gunn. He wanted to start an organization that would pay tribute and honor race car drivers who had raced at Williams Grove Speedway. Within 1 year of starting the organization, the Williams Grove Old Timers had attracted over 350 members in 10 different states. And what you're seeing on the slide here is some of the early photographs of the organization. On the top left, you have pictures from the first convention where we featured track time at Williams Grove Speedway, as well as on-track interviews with some racing greats, including Tommy Hennerschitz. He was always a big supporter of the organization when it started. In the early 1980s, the organization decided that they wanted to have a permanent home, a museum, as well as an exhibition track where they could host track time. So they purchased the Latimer Valley Fairgrounds in 1982, and that picture is down on the bottom left. You can see how they worked throughout the early 80s to rediscover that old ghost track. It was a track that raced in the 20s and 30s. It was a local fairgrounds track, an outlaw track. We'll talk about those today in AAA, where drivers in the area could get their start in open wheel cars. So from 1983 to the present, we've hosted vintage track times at Latimer Valley at the fairgrounds each year. And over that process, then we have static displays. You can see some of those cars on display in the infield in the center picture. And on the right, you can see an early display. In the early 80s, they had this vision to have a museum on the property, and they started a major fundraising campaign. But until the museum was constructed, then they would make makeshift museums in the infield and have boards of pictures and other displays along with the static displays of race cars. So the museum, you can see an early picture there on the right, opened to the public in 1989 and has gone through a variety of expansions since that period to what it is today. Next slide, please. For over 50 years then, we've really focused on preserving racing history, and education has always been at the center of the organization. We've done this in a variety of different aspects. The track times allow people to engage directly with those historic race cars. You can hear them, smell the exhaust, see the colors, and see the cars on the track. Then we have other ways that we like to connect and have hands-on history with our visitors, both inside and outside of the museum. So we really focus at EMMR on experiential learning. And you can see that idea here where you experience it, then you think about it, and then you react to it. And that's how we base our educational programming. In addition to those track times, we host a third Sunday roundtable series where we have monthly roundtables with a variety of different people that have been involved in aspects of motor racing. So over the years, we've had sprint car great Steve Kinzer, the Eagles coach Dick Vermeil, because he has ties to racing with his parents, as well as Jimmy Spencer, who you see here, the NASCAR driver, and also Bruce Larson, who's a popular drag racer in the area, has presented at our roundtables. We try to get involved with the local community and do outreach as well. And you may have attended the sprint car experience that's been hosted at the Hershey Stadium the last 2 years. So we were there to allow kids from Milton Hershey to get into some of the historic race cars that were on display in the interior of the stadium. Additionally, we have activities to try to engage kids at the museum, one of which is valve cover racing. So the kids can create their own valve covers and then come and race them periodically throughout the year at the museum. Next slide, please.
Alison has been researching Pennsylvania racing history for over a decade, and I have been actively writing and researching about Pennsylvania racing for 30 years. What motivates us is finding those missing historical nuggets, those real gems that are out there, and uncovering new stories about Americans' experiences with motor racing. And as you can see up here, these are some of the vehicles and the objects that we have in our collection. And over there is one of our oldest. That motorcycle racing photo is from 1899. And that is probably I'm sure, the oldest photo that we have in our collection. That is from a motorcycle race in Philadelphia, and that's 1899. So you can see the amount and the extent of our collection. And you can see it goes from race cars down to snowmobiles. We have a wide variety of racing equipment. How do we find these historical gems? For me, one approach has always been to ask new questions. Whose stories aren't being told in the typical narrative of racing development, and why? What factors contribute to changes in the sport during different time periods? A second approach is to the starting point of your source material. Almost weekly at EMMR, we get one-of-a-kind donations of racing artifacts. And lately, we've been getting a lot of artifacts. We put in recently high new shelving, and it's already full with the collections that have been coming in. Starting with the objects themselves encourages new directions for historical research. Finally, Alison and I both use historical newspapers extensively to flesh out our historical investigations. When Bill asked us to speak today about the history of racing in Pennsylvania, Alison and I started talking about racing in Pennsylvania going back to the turn of the 20th century. We're looking at early hill climbs, endurance races in passenger automobiles, motorcycle racing, and to the rise of purpose-built race cars at horse tracks, to the diversification of open-wheel racing, and finally the rise of drag racing in the second half of the century. There's no way we can do justice to all these types of racing in just 1 hour. So what we decided to do is focus today's conversation on what racing in Pennsylvania was like 100 years ago. Where would Pennsylvanians go to see racing in the 1920s? Who would race throughout the state? How was racing changed in Pennsylvania by the early 1930s? Through a series of case studies that we'll share with you today, we hope you learn at least one thing you didn't know before about racing in Pennsylvania. Our goal is to encourage all of you to come visit the Eastern Museum to explore our collection and learn how Pennsylvania motorsports continued to develop following the Second World War.
Next slide, please. So here at AACA, you can see all of these examples of early automobile technology. And that was really the start of how racing developed within the state of Pennsylvania. You had people, as they started to buy their first automobiles, experiment with that technology and want to test it. And a place that they could go to test it was their local fairgrounds. They had all these circle dirt horse tracks available, and pretty soon people wanted to get their automobiles on those tracks and test them out. So we have then local fairgrounds as this first place where you could go to see racing. And that intensified after 1924, because in 1924, the state passed a new law that wanted to curb what they called immoral acts that were happening on the midways at these fairs. So the fair promoters panicked. Well, what are we going to do? They've cut out all of our entertainment. We need a new form of entertainment to engage people and bring them into the fairs. What about automobile racing? So if you look back through the newspaper record, in that period of 1924, there's all of these small fairground tracks that start to have automobile racing for the first time. And one example is in Warren, Pennsylvania. You can see the ad for that first race that they had in 1924 at their fair on the left. And the paper stated that the town of Warren looked deserted on the day of September 4th, 1924. All the businesses had closed down, and they released their employees to attend the Warren Borough Day at the local fairgrounds. Automobile races were being hosted for the first time on their half-mile track. The race drivers kept a crowd of, they said, over 4,000 engaged from 2 to 5 p.m. And you can see here pictures of some of those early fairground races at the Lebanon Valley Fairgrounds. So that's just kind of an example of what they look like. Look at the safety features. These are tracks that are made for horses. So we'll talk today about that tension of a landscape that was made for one purpose, but then used for a different purpose, and trying to navigate those landscapes, especially in terms of safety as we move throughout the 1920s and 1930s. Next slide, please.
The American Automobile Association, still active today as AAA Auto Club, was the main sanctioning body for automobile racing at the time. To have a AAA sanction on your race was a badge of honor. At first, only AAA sanctioned races on tracks a mile or larger. Now, a little side story. There was a track in Western Pennsylvania, Arden Downs, that pulled a little trick on AAA. They were a half-mile track. They sent their paperwork in and listed themselves as a mile track. And when AAA arrived, they were not happy. So they allowed the race to go on, but then they banned Arden Downs for a while. They would not allow them to have a race, but that's how they actually got their AAA sanction for a race. The racing situation at the time was much the same as our present time. If AAA sanctioned the event, usually a handful of AAA stars would participate in the race. The remainder of the racing field was filled by local cars. It is a situation that could be paired to our present day World of Outlaws sprint cars. They bring in some star drivers, and the remainder of the field will be local competitors.
Next slide, please. Several of the era's stars were also proficient on various types of tracks. They were racing at those fairground dirt tracks, as well as on boards and the bricks of Indy. A board track was located near Altoona, Pennsylvania, on the main line of the Pennsylvania Railroad. And this was a 1.25 mile track that was designed by Jack Prince. So this track was constructed totally of boards. They had to lay 4 million board feet of straight grain yellow pine lumber to build the track. And you can imagine the time and the money that it took to construct that speedway. After all of that work, only 17 races were held at the speedway between 1923 and 1931. This track featured those AAA championship style cars that you'd see race at Indianapolis. So the stars that people heard on the radio throughout Pennsylvania when they listened in for the Indianapolis 500 would then come to their own backyard to Altoona. The nation's top stars came to the track, and it's similar to that Kyle Larson experience today, right? You can see Kyle Larson on TV in NASCAR. He's now entering the Indianapolis 500, but he's also competing on the World of Outlaws and other circuits that are doing sprint cars throughout the nation. What you see here, though, is kind of fascinating also from an institutional history background with EMMR. The picture on the far left is a picture of what the track at Altoona looked like in 1983 and what it originally looked like, those boards in 1923, excuse me. So this is one of the first collections that came into the Eastern Museum of Motor Racing. Almost 6 years before the museum was even constructed, a man named Junior Palmer donated over 3,000 items about Altoona Speedway history to the museum, one of which was the program in the middle, the picture on the right, and the picture on the lower left. And a group of our early board members in '83 went out to Altoona. They took Junior Palmer's pictures from the 20s and tried to find the track. And then they documented what they saw there in the 80s. So we have two periods of history documented, what the track originally looked like in the 20s, and then what the state of the track was, that kind of ghost track area you can see on the top there in the weeds that had been overgrown by the period of the early 80s. On the far right, you can see how dangerous the board tracks were. They had this steep curve so the cars could get high speeds, which the drivers enjoyed. The problem there was that then the speeds were intensified, and that meant more accidents. And when you think about boards, if you have accidents involving fire, then the track would have these gaping holes. And that happened here in 1929 when Indianapolis driver Ray Keach died in an accident at Altoona Speedway. And you can see the remains there of those boards. It's a very good picture to see all those boards that were laid vertically to make the track surface, and then what would happen. And even with smaller accidents throughout the course of these races, they get little holes in the track, and they put flags up from underneath to try to tell the drivers where those holes were. So can you imagine navigating around this track at high speeds, and then there's these little flags trying to tell you where to go. So there's a constant upkeep and expense with board tracks, which made them over time unrealistic as one of the main racing track surfaces in the eastern United States, and especially in Pennsylvania. Next slide, please.
Through AAA sanctioned events, Pennsylvanians could see the biggest racing stars of the day in their own backyards. One star driver every track was hoping to draw was Ralph De Palma, pictured here. De Palma won the 1915 Indianapolis 500. In an interview from the 1920s, De Palma talked about his views on racing. "Automobile racing is the cleanest and fairest of all," said De Palma. "Lots of people out there believe that every race is fixed before it starts and that every accident is planned by the poor drivers just to give the fans a thrill. They are wrong. Every man who competes in automobile races believes that he is the best in the world. Give a driver a large crowd for whom he can perform, and he will fairly eat up the track, hitting the curves with the gas feed down, roaring on the straightaways like a demon. The drivers are just too busy to try to reach the top to be bothered with dirty and unfair topics. Then, too, prizes to automobile races are small, exceedingly small. Good dirt track drivers are making a living, but not much more." And I think dirt track drivers today will tell you the exact same thing. Ralph De Palma toured the country towing his racing machine. Starting in 1924, he began competing in a Miller Special. The Michigan driver had Wesley Crawford and Reeves Stanley serving as his mechanics. De Palma's engine used a supercharger of his own design. De Palma said his engine had a price tag of $10,500. Now that price tag should raise plenty of eyebrows, because when you go and compute it for inflation today, Ralph De Palma's engine would cost $158,262. I mean, even for a NASCAR engine. That's expensive. When the nationally known drivers arrived at a local track, sometimes there would be stiff competition from the local talent, such as Lafayette Stallman, better known as Leif Stallman. Stallman competed at the tracks that were outside the AAA sanction. AAA had a ban on their drivers competing on tracks outside the AAA sanction. Some of the AAA drivers did race at non-sanctioned events using an alias, which makes it sometimes difficult for racing historians. And believe me, being a historian, I have had nightmares trying to track down some of these drivers with the aliases they used. Some of the star AAA competitors raced in the outlaw races. The Brookville, Pennsylvania driver traveled around to several states and was quite successful competing in a 16-valve Dodge. In 1924, he made the decision to retire from racing. In the Jefferson Democrat newspaper, Leif Stallman placed an advertisement listing his race car for sale. The advertisement read as such: "For sale, racing car, elegant condition, equipped with the best racing equipment money can buy, has record for half-mile track of 29 seconds, has record for mile track of 52 seconds, is light and fast, will sell to the right buyer. Reason for selling: am in business and cannot follow it up." Another probable reason for his 1924 retirement came on August 9, 1924. He was leading a race when a lap car crowded him into the fencing. His Dodge struck the fence, and a 12-year-old boy that was sitting on the fencing was instantly killed. Stallman's car went down an embankment, landed on a sand pile. Stallman had several broken ribs, severe cuts, and a wrenched back. Stallman's retirement was short, though. He built a new car he called a Fronta Buick. He took a Frontenac and a Buick, combining both parts from both machines. Stallman constructed a new and quick car. Stallman became an outlaw driver long before the term outlaws came popular. He sought out high-paying races around the Middle Atlantic region. And this is his car right here. And this was the $1,000 one. I believe this was at New Kensington, which I'm about to go into. In 1926, New Kensington half-mile track, which is located north of Pittsburgh, opened. The track was called the $1 Million Speedway due to the cost of building the raceway, and it opened with a non-sanctioned automobile race. To attract attention, plus drivers and racing fans, the raceway's management decided to pay $1,000 to the winner, which will be the equivalent of almost $18,000 today. That money brought Leif Stallman, and he won the race. Stallman's outlaw style caught up to him in 1926. AAA began to move into the tracks that dotted the western section of Pennsylvania. AAA made an ultimatum. You have to join AAA if you want to compete in our races. If you join AAA, you can no longer race at tracks not sanctioned by AAA. On July 24, 1926, Leif Stallman won a AAA sanctioned race at the Du Bois Fairground. A week later, he was competing in a race not sanctioned by AAA. AAA's actions were quick. On August 4, AAA announced Leif Stallman was disqualified from the Du Bois win because the July 31 race was a contest neither sanctioned nor supervised by the contest board. AAA also announced Stallman was permanently barred from any future AAA contests. Stallman's excursion into non-sanctioned field was a particular flagrant violation of regulations, the AAA board statement said, coming as it did only a few days after the bars had been let down at his most urgent appeal to be permitted to enter sanctioned racing. Neither this board nor the AAA has any quarrel with any promoters, car owners, and drivers outside its sanction, but it does have a standard which is not often equaled. It desires that this standard shall set an example that nothing shall dim its present and well-defined leadership, that the attempt that it has made to make racing clean, and girt with safety shall not be undermined. Unless AAA drivers live up to these standards, they cannot be maintained, and no driver can live up to them by racing today on a track sanctioned by AAA and tomorrow on one that does not qualify. Did this deter Leif Stallman? Not in the least. He continued his outlaw-style racing, working around the AAA sanctioned tracks. He continued racing into the early 1930s. However, the ban by AAA did keep him from making that next big step up the racing ladder. He probably would have been a good IndyCar driver, but AAA was Indy. So therefore, Leif could not make that next step up, but he did well in racing by going around AAA. So that was one reason you probably have not heard of Leif Stallman, because of the fact that AAA just, they set that bar and they said, you cannot go any farther. This is it. Next slide, please.
Throughout the 20th century, sports have served as a great equalizer for Americans, and this is especially true with automobile racing. Once a driver steps into the cockpit of their race car, factors such as their education, socioeconomic status, race or ethnicity, gender, and physical appearance can disappear. Unlike in stick and ball sports, a race car can act as its own type of mask. And one of the drivers who tried to take advantage of this was Andy Crumshaw. He wasn't a famous racing star that you've probably heard of, but he does have a fascinating story in terms of racing determination. Crumshaw was from Alliance, Ohio. Due to an issue at birth, Crumshaw lost both of his legs at the hip. He also had part of his right arm amputated. Despite the inflictions, Crumshaw went after life with a gusto. He not only wanted to operate his own business and ran a successful newsstand and retail business on the east side of Alliance, he also wanted to build his own car, his passenger car, and worked to construct a luxury car that he drove across the country. Additionally, he loved racing, so he wanted to take a Frontenac and rebuilt it. He modified it so that he could drive it, and he would steer the car with his left arm, while he made an extension to place on his right arm to be able to operate the brake and the gas. Crumshaw toured the country and especially competed in races in the eastern United States. Many of the tracks would advertise his upcoming races, stating that an invalid driver would be competing, but Crumshaw was anything but an invalid. He was a competitive racer and often finished in the top 10. He won a feature at a fairgrounds located near Altoona, PA, racing during this period of the 1920s. His picture would appear in Pennsylvania newspapers, and it would document his career, his participation in the sport. You could see this picture that was on the left showing Crumshaw beside his race car, as well as some of those advertisements that showed promoters were trying to use him as a publicity stunt to an extent. The Pittsburgh Gazette and smaller publications such as the Bedford Gazette, as well as the Lancaster New Era, published stories about Crumshaw throughout the decade. He's one of several dirt track drivers during this period of the 1920s and 30s who participated with physical disabilities. You may have heard of another popular driver, Bill Schindler, who was a contemporary of Crumshaw. Schindler lost his leg in a racing accident, but continued to compete in midget racing throughout the 1930s. Next slide, please. Americans used their participation in sports then to push for greater equality within American society. African Americans faced de facto segregation at America's speedways. Although few racing organizations openly prohibited Black drivers, participants would be turned away when they showed up with their race cars at the pit gate. To combat their exclusion from the sport, African Americans in the Midwest formed their own racing organization in 1924, the Colored Speedway Association, and they hosted an annual automobile race at the Indianapolis Fairgrounds called the Golden Glory Sweepstakes in the 1920s and 1930s. This was a race that was exclusively for African American drivers. So you're in Indianapolis, that heart of the racing community, and you're racing in cars that are very similar to the ones that are competing at Indianapolis, and trying then, through participation in racing, to dispel widely held negative stereotypes and demonstrate their abilities to compete at the same level as their white peers. One of the first races that Steve and I found for African-American drivers in Pennsylvania happened at Arden Downs on July 4th, 1927. A Pittsburgh native, Norman Toots Washington, piloted his runny Ford to victory in front of an estimated 6,000 fans. 5 competitors competed in a 100-lap race around the half-mile speedway. A reporter for the African-American press wrote, quote, "Dirt track racing is a death-defying, dangerous game. Those who succeed in the thrilling pastime are not only possessed of superlative driving skill, but a high order of courage and cool self-control. The short hazard curves are almost certain death to an unexperienced tyro. Equipped with little more than sheer courage, he seldom survives his baptism of fire." So think about all those things in that quote that are highlighting this positive image of African Americans through racing. Driving skill, courage and bravery, self-control. All of these things were then a way to change the image of African Americans in the larger white society at the time. The Black press was optimistic when a second speed contest was scheduled for Arden Downs for African American drivers on Labor Day of that year. They anticipated that it would be the largest social and sporting event for the African American community in Western PA, especially in that Pittsburgh region. However, white promoters for the second race failed to live up to their pre-promotional promises. William Nunn, a sports reporter for the Pittsburgh Courier, wrote, "It has proven that the white man thinks the Negro is easy prey for big money and quick money insofar as promotion events is concerned. They had promised lap cars, a specific car count, as well as entertainment and also track conditions. And none of those pre-race promotions were followed through." So Nunn was frustrated with this, and he said that he would not cover future racing events or other sporting events in the Pittsburgh Courier that were hosted for African Americans by white promoters unless those promoters followed through with their advertised promises prior to those sporting engagements. And throughout then the 20th century, African Americans continued to face discrimination and exclusion from automobile racing well into the second half of the 20th century. Next slide, please.
Racing was profitable, and this money brought the seedier underside of the sport. White drivers similarly faced instances where promoters failed to pay the advertised purse. The sport also attracted the attention of organized crime. I found an interesting story about organized crime in the 1920s racing. This came in 1922, the Uniontown Speedway, pictured here, and this is the dirt version. There was a board track there, and after the board track went out, they built a dirt track. This is the second track. Uniontown Speedway was one of the leading raceways in the country. The criminal element saw an opportunity and began sending individuals into the track to open up a betting line. A lot of money was exchanging hands as bets were being placed not only on the outcome of the race, but on other elements of the event. In 1922, the track's management learned of the activity and alerted the police. The Speedway management issued a press release stating that no gambling will be allowed inside the track's gates. The press release read, "A number of sportively inclined gentlemen have been attempting to make books on big events, and it is to block the plans of these men. Anyone detected making a bet at the track on Saturday will be ejected without ceremony. There will be a number of police officers in plain clothes stationed throughout the grandstand and infield on Saturday with orders to place anyone under arrest who violates the rules with this respect." The Uniontown newspaper decided to investigate the betting situation. While the Uniontown Speedway management could control the betting inside the track's gates, they had no control outside the speedway. The newspaper found bookies had set up betting. Some of the wagers were what the newspaper called of freakish nature. Some of the wagers discovered by the paper included odds of 2-to-1 that an accident would occur on Death Cur, where several spills had taken place. There was even money that none of the cars would change a front tire. 2-to-1 was offered that none of the drivers would go the entire 225 miles without making a stop. There was even money that 1,000 automobiles will be parked inside the speedway. And I wonder who had the chore of going around and counting all those automobiles in the infield. There was 3-to-1 that rain will not interfere with the event, and 4-to-1 that no one will be killed in the race. It was 6-to-1 that the winner will not lead all the laps, and even money that the engine trouble will put at least 2 cars out of the race. Other strange wagers were the winning car will have an odd number, and another bet was whether the feature winner will be a married man. Next slide, please.
Here you can see 12 of the top drivers on the East Coast Circuit posing for a photograph at New Jersey's Woodbridge Speedway in 1932. The Dynamic Dozen were vying for the AAA Eastern Championship crown. Over the course of the racing season, they swapped victories at Woodbridge as well as several Pennsylvania tracks. Each man knew that his constant pursuit of victory involved high risk. At Woodbridge's first race of the 1932 season, 2 Philadelphia drivers, Frank Farmer and Bill Neapolitan, died in an on-track collision. Farmer had attempted to pass Neapolitan on the inside of the track during a qualifying heat. The 2 cars collided at 60 miles per hour. Neapolitan was ejected from his race car. He died from extensive internal injuries, while Farmer suffered a compound fracture to his skull. Serious injuries sustained by their competitors did not deter other men from competing in racing events. These 12 guys were there later in the season, all ready to race and had their picture taken before one of those competitions. Racing during the 1930s, however, remained dangerous and unpredictable. By 1938, that's only 6 years after this photograph was taken, 7 out of the 12 drivers pictured here would perish in automobile accidents. So that's a rate of above 50% of death in just a period of 6 years. When racing began, the horse tracks were fine for automobiles. By the 1930s, race teams had found ways to increase the speed and power of their cars. Racing was outgrowing the horse tracks. The fairground tracks had safety features, fine for horses, but not for high-paced automobiles. The single board fences around these tracks could not contain the speedy cars when there were collisions. The fairground complexes also allowed fans, especially young children, as Steve mentioned previously, to stand all around the track. By 1933, one of racing's greatest stars became one of its most outspoken critics. Barney Oldfield, a member of the AAA contest board, suddenly could no longer see a future for the sport, mostly due to the carnage. He told reporters, quote, "Automobile racing has outlived its usefulness. It has ceased to be racing and has become merely a morbid and brutal spectacle. The science of speed has reached a point where any manufacturer can produce a car which will satisfy any sane buyer. Few of your average automobile race fans know or care anything about the finer points of the cars or the races. They watch without interest, the most skilled in delicate driving, but let a tire burst, a wheel skid, a car brake for a fence, they are out of their seats in a flash. Racing cars are now too fast for the tracks, and I doubt if safe tracks can even ever be constructed, especially with the demand for speed and more hazards." When you read Chris Economacki's tremendous book, Let 'Em All Go, you begin to understand this decade of racing. Economacki tries to discuss how death was accepted as an inherent risk within the sport during that period of the 1930s. And he shares a story about how he arrived at the races late. He ran up to the pit gate and he asked the woman who was taking tickets and signing everyone in, "What's going on? Where are we at in the program?" And she said, "Oh, a man just died in one of the heat races." And he said, "Well, who won?" You know, it was an immediate response that death had happened. That was unfortunate, but that driver had taken on that risk by participating, and that the racing should go on. It wasn't like it is today when there's a bad wreck. There wasn't an inquiry, there wasn't a big report that was published, or any evaluation of what could be done to prevent that accident or a similar one in the future. Next slide, please.
While the federal government failed to intervene to restrict racing, global economics did have an impact on the sport. During the Great Depression, there were fewer races held at the small town fairground ovals. The majority of races were at the established fairground tracks, usually a city track or a county fairground. And as you can see here, this is a listing of different tracks that they ran at, and all of them, you see fair, they're fairground tracks. That was the main racing facility at the time. Although the number of races dropped, the crowds did not. The newspaper accounts continued to report large crowds. I took a look at baseball attendance during the same time frame. The stronger teams were reporting record crowds, while the smaller baseball clubs were struggling. Although the money was tight, people still wanted to be entertained. Next slide. I did notice one trend with racing events. There were mentions about the number of people watching events for free. People were finding hillsides, trees, anything they could use outside the racing grounds to see the races. Now in this photograph, this is the Bloomsburg Fairgrounds. You see the circle up there? There's a gentleman on top of the roof up there watching the races for free. You can't quite see it, but up here there's a gentleman watching the races for free. When we were talking about safety, this car's hitting the fence. There's a man behind the fence dodging the race car. And something I do want to mention that's going to be coming up here shortly, the dust. You see all the dust with it. That's part of the danger, but people were finding anything that they could to watch the races for free. And here they are on top of the buildings outside the turn at Bloomsburg. And I actually hate to say it, but when I was a kid and they had the midget races at Bloomsburg, I used to sneak in behind the concession stands behind the turns and watch the races. So I'm guilty too. The race at Arden's Downs is an example of the hard times. The article mentioned that 27 people were arrested trying to crash the gate at the track. The 27 were taken to the Justice of the Peace, James Stauffer, on charges of trespassing. All 27 were fined $1 plus cost, showing how hard it was at the time. 25 of the 27 could not afford the $1 plus costs and were committed to the county jail. A day later, family members paid the fines and all but one were released. Times were hard for people and times were about to become hard for racing. There was another problem brewing, and by the middle of the 1930s, it had become a serious issue, and that was dust. And this is what I'm talking about here. In researching racing during the 1930s, so many articles mentioned the dust. The dirt horse tracks, paired with the increasing power and speed of the cars, billowing, blinding clouds of dust. Most tracks also didn't have lights for night racing, forcing the promoters to host afternoon events during the hottest part of the day. Dust dramatically increased the danger factor of automobile races. One interesting story from the Bloomsburg Fairground, this track, highlights the dust issue. A main event began, and immediately clouds of dust arose from the racing surface. In the early laps, a car crashed into the fencing, entering the third turn. The impact sent the driver hurtling out of the car, his body landing on the track. The accident occurred in front of the ambulance crew. With the heavy dust, the race officials were unaware a crash occurred in the third turn. The ambulance crew bravely went over the fence, pulled the driver from the track. They placed him in the ambulance and quickly left for the local hospital. When the driver arrived at the hospital staff wanted information on their patient. They called the track asking for information on the driver injured during the race. Track officials, still unaware a crash occurred, told the hospital staff person there must be some mistake. No one was injured in our race. The staff person replied, "We have a driver here. He is injured. He was injured at your track." The track official replied, "They were mistaken," and hung up. After the race was completed, the dust dissipated, and to the surprise of the track officials, there was a wrecked car against the third turn fence. Racetrack owners and promoters were experimenting with calcium chloride as a way to control the dust. Adding crude oil to the surface was another way to hamper the dust. Earlier, I mentioned the New Kensington track. There is a popular story told about an inventive way they handled the dust. Now, I have heard this story from several different people, so I know this story is probably fact. The track was located close to a paint factory. The story told is that the promoter went to the paint factory and purchased their unused, unwanted paint. He then applied the paint to the track surface for a midget race. The paint was not popular with the drivers. It did hinder the dust, but also adhered to the cars and the drivers. Next slide, please.
There were two saviors to the sport of automobile racing in the 1930s. The first was the realization that they had to start building purpose-built racetracks exclusively for automobile racing. By the mid-30s, the move away from the horse tracks began. New tracks were constructed that had bankings in the turns, better suited for the automobile speeds at the time. The fencing was built at a height to better contain automobiles. Another factor that changed the landscape and made racing safer was the start of grandstand seating, which helped to contain the crowds. No longer were spectators spread out around the track. Now fans were confined to one area in the grandstand, typically along the straightaway where accidents were less likely to occur. This sudden construction of new speedways led to an interesting situation here in central Pennsylvania. In 1939, two speedways were being constructed in the area simultaneously. Oddly enough, they were both being built at amusement parks. The first was at an unincorporated area known as Hershey. The second was at a small railroad hamlet known as Williams Grove. Roy Richwine was leading the construction at the new Williams Grove track, while Milton Hershey, of the Hershey chocolate fame, was heading up the Hershey project. Many don't realize that Milton Hershey was a racing enthusiast. Around 1920, he built a lot of property in the area with the vision of constructing a large road racing course. That didn't happen, but he did build a circle dirt track. Hershey and Richwine suddenly realized they had another problem in 1939. They were planning to open their tracks the same week. We have competitors here for those entertainment dollars. The two agreed to have a meeting, and at the end of the meeting, they agreed that Hershey would open Thursday and Williams Grove would open on Sunday. And these tracks both opened then in May of 1939. Hershey almost came to an explosive end in that first year. They were scheduled to have a large fireworks display at the races. The races and fireworks were rained out, so Hershey instructed his workers to store those fireworks under the front straightaway grandstands. During the week, a worker tossed a cigarette and it landed on the fireworks. This created a large explosive scene under the stands. Thankfully, the Hershey grandstands were made of concrete and were able to withstand the explosion. But racing continued then at both Hershey and Williams Grove throughout that period of leading up to World War II and even after. So Hershey hosted midget races in the 30s. They would race again at different periods, not consistently, but up to the early 1980s, whereas Williams Grove has hosted weekly programs consistently and does so to this day. Next slide, please.
The second savior of the sport came, according to racing historian Crocky Wright, on June 4, 1933 at Hughes Stadium in Sacramento, California. On that day, a new form of racing came to life. Midget racing was born and would soon be sweeping eastward. On June 10, 1934, promoter Phil Putnam staged the first Eastern midget race. This held at Olympic Park in Irvington, New Jersey. Malcolm McKenzie is listed as winning the first Eastern midget race. And you can see up here the blueprints for a midget. This is what a midget race car is at that time and what they look like right here. Midget racing captured the fascination of the American public. Called midgets, the cars looked like open cockpit cars that raced on the fairground speedways, but they were smaller in dimensions. The small racing machines could race with new forms of racing venues. High school stadiums became popular racing facilities as the small machines battled on the high school tracks. Stadiums of all types, be it football or baseball, were now the new venues for the midgets. This also meant that racing could now be hosted in urban centers accessible by public transport. Next slide, please. One example is the Allentown Fairgrounds Speedway, seen here in the aerial photograph that was taken in 1938. And they haven't raced there for quite a while, but the track is still there at the Allentown Fairground. The popularity of midgets cannot be understated. Promoter Bill Heiserman, who was one of the main promoters that really got midget racing going here in the East, stated that he paid out $192,018.50 in midget purses in just 1934 and 1935. Using the inflation calculator, today that would be $3,555,078. Next slide, please. On the East Coast, midget racing opened the sports door for many aspiring drivers. One was Joe Bocchino from Woodside, Long Island. This is Joe's picture here, and I want to point out he is wearing a suit in this picture. Now, I guarantee he didn't wear the suit, but a lot of times drivers in those days did wear dress shirts and ties when they raced. So I would not be surprised that that shirt and that tie probably saw some racing action. He started his driving career with the speedsters, but struggled. The midgets offered a new opportunity, and Bocchino took advantage of the new sport. Although not a known feature winner, Bocchino was on top of his game in qualifying, winning a number of heats and semifinals. Joe Bocchino is typical of quite a number of struggling young men in the sport of auto racing, read a press release, who have been following a dream. Joe's early schooling goes back to 1934 when he broke in with the Garden State Association in an attempt to make it. He encountered the same problems as those preceding him. A lack of good equipment, but there was a ray of hope during the initial season when he placed in the top 5 in a race meet staged at Woodbridge, New Jersey. This was enough to keep him focused. He sat out the 35 season due to the lack of a decent ride, but in 1936, we find him taking part in 19 midget programs, namely Bridgeport, Philadelphia, West Haven, and Freeport. He tried his hand with a marine-type power plant known as a Van Blerk, but has since shifted his attention to a Ford 60, which is proving to provide the necessary step to move his career along. Born and raised in Scranton, Pennsylvania, Joe now makes his home on Long Island, which puts him in close proximity with the tracks that make up the Heiserman circuit. Next slide, please.
Midget racing became so popular, it was possible to see racing almost every night of the week at multiple different tracks. So drivers like Tommy Hennerschitz that were living in the greater Philadelphia region had access to tracks not only in the Philadelphia area, but also in New Jersey and New York. And really, he had his pick. He could race every night of the week for midgets during the week, and then on the weekends, go to the fairgrounds tracks to race big cars. So not only did you have multiple racing venues, but men were participating in multiple different divisions of racing. They were co-competing in both midget cars and big cars at the same time. In the Philadelphia area, there was Yellow Jacket Stadium, which was a midget track that was located downtown. And men such as Tommy Hennerschitz were then racing outside at the fairground tracks and also inside at some places such as the Bronx Castle Hill, which were inside tracks. This one is a track that needs mention when we're talking about midgets during this period, and that's the Nutley Velodrome. The Nutley Velodrome was a bicycle track located in New Jersey, and it was a 6-mile distance with a 45-degree banking in the turns. People thought promoter Jack Kochman was crazy when he suggested racing midgets at the velodrome. Even Kochman had some doubts, and he enlisted some local drivers for practice laps. During this practice, they found that they could turn laps in about 8.5 seconds at a speed of 72 miles an hour. When Tommy Hennerschitz talked about racing at Nutley, he said that the track's small size and steep banking made it impossible to keep track of where you were on the speedway at all times. You would lose perspective during the race. The cars would circle the track so quickly, he couldn't tell if he was in a straight or in a turn during the race. The track was doomed to fail from its opening day, On August 1939, a driver was killed in an accident, and this was the third fatality at the Speedway in just 60 races. The town of Nutley had had enough, and they asked that the track be banned. In March 1942, the velodrome was torn down, and today it's a park. So it's an example of one of these tracks that had a very short success within the midget racing craze of the late 1930s. Next slide, please.
With midget racing booming and big car competition continuing, a good problem arose. There were too many races. Drivers and cars were being stretched thin. Promoters began to complain as the racing schedule filled drastically. The problem became pronounced in the fall when the county fairs were at their height. In central Pennsylvania, there was the Lebanon Fairground with its weekly big car races. A half-mile north of the Lebanon Fairground was the Pleasant Hill Gun Club midget track. Both raced on Sundays. Adding to the confusion, just outside of Lancaster was the Central Speedway and their weekly big car events. Lebanon promoter Mark Light knew this was not going to work. Light held a meeting with other promoters and they came up with a solution. Lebanon and Central would alternate weeks with their big car races. Pleasant Hill held midget races on Sundays when Lebanon Fairground was not racing. As the 1930s came to an end, another form of racing was gaining ground in the sections of the country. Jalopy racing was making a hit, and this is a photo of a jalopy. This is actually taken at Hilltop Speedway in Myerstown. And what is kind of interesting is there were two tracks in Myerstown that ran jalopies, Hilltop and Zeller's Grove. Hilltop was on top of the hill, Zeller's Grove was on the bottom of the hill. You could almost see the tracks from each other. Do you think they would cooperate with each other? No, they often raced against each other. So one race would be going on top of the hill, one race would be going on the bottom of the hill. This track is actually still there in the weeds. Just recently, Zeller's Grove was, it disappeared. I think there's houses on it now, but it was an interesting situation. The crude form of racing cars, often stripped down to their frames, could race almost anywhere, often in open fields on autocross-style tracks. This very cheap form of racing became a sudden money-making proposition. Fire companies and local organizations staged jalopy races as fundraisers. And another thing that's interesting about it is the track names. Out in western Pennsylvania, there was Satan's Bowl of Death. Another one was the Cliffs of Death. They had such really unique, strange names for a lot of these jalopy tracks. All of this great racing was about to come to the end as the war in Europe was increasing. In 1942, the government shut down automobile racing in its entirety. Well, almost. And there were outlaw races that occurred that you will not find in newspapers during the war. There were some outlaw tracks. There was one very notorious one here in Pennsylvania near Williamsport that finally the government went in and shut them down. But there were some outlaw races that did still go on during World War II, even though the government had shut down racing. And the tracks were idle until late 1945. The momentum racing gained in the 1920s and 30s was lost due to the war effort. But once racing came back at the end of 1945, it came back with a gusto. The start of 1946, when Williams Grove started racing again, they had huge crowds, enormous crowds of people coming back. And the racing just, it almost like it picked up where it left off. The midgets and the big cars became really popular. This car you see here, this is a TQ midget. TQ midget racing all of a sudden became popular. And then the stock car racing. So racing, the momentum it lost, it gained it all back after the war. So the sport, it just continued on because of its popularity. And you would think that those few years that it lost, maybe it would lose something, but it never did. It just continued on, and people were so hungry for it when it came back.
So we encourage you to come to the Eastern Museum of Racing to hear the second half of the story. to experience what racing was like in the second half of the 20th century. And as Steve said, we have a lot of midget and big cars, which become sprint cars on display. So you can trace 100 years of that technology and evolution of open wheel racing at the museum. But the diversification that we see in the post-war period is also represented in our museum as well. So we have stock cars on display, late models and street stocks to represent those types of racing that comes out of the hobby class that you see here, as well as an extensive display on drag racing, which is another form of racing that is popular in the second half of the 20th century. If there's any questions, we can answer those at this time, but we're so excited to be here and thank you all for listening. Sure. So the question that came in online was about the location of the Eastern Museum of Motor Racing and our hours. We're located along Route 15 between Mechanicsburg and Gettysburg. So if you put it in your GPS, we're in York Springs and located right off Route 15, you'll see we have a sign with a race car above the sign and a dummy race car driver in the car that welcomes you when you turn off Route 15. We're open right now Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. And at the end of October, then we'll go down to our winter hours, which means that we'll just be open on Fridays from 10 to 4, and then for special events that we have. And you can find more information and including our schedule of events at EMMR.com. So we encourage you all to go to our website to get more information that you need before you plan your visit.
This is Bill Sangri. I'm a volunteer at the museum. Just wanted to give a plug in for what's coming here at the AACA Museum. We change our main floor display every 6 months. Starting in mid-November, the feature display will be forgotten features. Examples of that include the gas filler cap and the gas filler cap hidden under the taillight. For example, the example we'll have is actually a Buick, but the one I remember is the 56 Chevy that I couldn't find when it came in, and I was a 75 cents a dollar. Maybe I was making 75 cents. I'm not sure. Four-door convertible sedans. Examples like that. So we'll probably have 30, we'll have the first floor full of those. So that starts in mid-November. And then in May next year, at this time of the year, we'll have station wagons back again, which is a favorite for everyone. Thank you.